Welcome to Passionate World Talk Radio. Educate, enlighten, entertain.
Welcome to Creative Psychotherapy, produced by Passionate World Talk Radio. I'm your host, Audrey O'Neill, a psychotherapist based in New York. In today's episode, I'm going to discuss the work of psychoanalyst Karen Horney. I will be exploring her birth, her childhood, education, as well as family issues of importance. The major theories related to her work I will also be mentioning, as well as my own understanding of her theories. Finally, I will provide a summation of how Hornay's theory applies and can be used currently in one's own work with clients. It is, in a sense, a representation of an application of the research and information collected and its application to my own practice and perhaps to that of others. I'll begin with discussing the life of theorist Karen Horney. Hornay was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1885, and she passed away in 1952 after founding the American Institute for Psychoanalysis. According to Sterling, 2015, Hornay embraced 3 childhood wishes that included becoming an actress, a doctor, a wife, and mother. Her father was a sea captain and a Lutheran pastor who held fundamentalist views that embraced the idea that women were inferior to men, as well as being a source of evil. Sterling explained that Hornay had ambivalent feelings towards her father. On the other hand, she found his negative statements about her physical appearance and intelligence abhorrent. On the other hand, she appreciated his wanderlust and the exposure to travel he provided by taking her along on seafaring trips to far-flung destinations. It is also explained by the researcher that Hornay's father developed a reputation for having fits of anger and demonstrated it by throwing a Bible across the room at her mother. As a result, Hornay began to experience both religion and authority as anathema. Early on in her life, Hornay aspired to become a physician, but especially at age 12 when she was treated by one at her village. Hornay's mother supported Karen's dream of being a physician, but her father opposed it wholeheartedly. And despite her father's discouragement, Hornay started medical school at age 21 at Freiburg, Germany. A few years later, in 1909, she married lawyer Oskar Hornay, and they had 3 children. In 1913, she finished her medical training at the University of Berlin, and she pursued psychoanalytic training at the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute, while also in private practice from 1918 until 1932. In 1932, she was invited by analyst Franz Alexander to join him in the United States and become an associate director of the Chicago Institute of Psychoanalysis, which had just been founded at the time. And she finally settled in New York to train analysts at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute in 1934 and established a private practice. The move entailed leaving her husband in Germany, divorcing, and taking her 2 children with her. Although she trained as a Freudian analyst, she eventually left the Institute and founded her own organization, the American Institute for Psychoanalysis, to promote her theories, which differed to that of Freud's. Rendon, in 2008, pointed out that Hornay was instrumental in the emergence of radical movement against psychoanalytic establishment of the time, which came to be referred to as non-Freudian or culturalist. Hornay was an early student of Freud, and she was opposed to his theories about feminine development. Some believe she may have been the woman identified in his papers and labeled a dissident. Eckhart, 2005, noted that Hornay questioned why Freud asserted that women felt inferior as a result of lacking a penis. Hornay did not argue that penis envy did not exist, but questioned whether it might be attributed to cultural and social factors instead. Smith, 2007, explained that unlike Freud, who viewed individuals as driven by the pleasure principle, Hornay believed that the individual pursued a need for emotional safety. She viewed powerful internal and external forces at the core of driving human behavior. Hornay theorized that each individual has a unique, universal inner power, which is the fountain of the growth process. She termed this power or force the real self and believed that each individual requires a combination of love, conflict, and frustration in order to develop in a healthy way. She asserted that if individuals cannot love the child or acknowledge the child's uniqueness, the child will become alienated and as a result develop anxiety. In her work, Hornay conceptualized the self as having three distinct aspects: real, ideal, and actual. Smith, 2007, noted that Hornay asserted that the real self cannot develop without a positive environment to nurture it. The ideal self emerges in response to anxiety produced in a chaotic or problematic environment. Hornay pointed out that the child becomes alienated when the caregiver cannot produce positive responses that engender growth. Smith, 2007, explained, the individual seeks then to handle feelings of isolation through fantasies of an idealized self in which a positive identity is present as well as emotional safety. Hornay also theorized that the ideal self contains a counterpart, the despised self, which fails to live up to expectations. Much of the loathing of the ideal self is targeted toward the actual self for not encompassing all it should be. Hornay referred to this phenomenon as the tyranny of the shoulds. According to Hornay, the actual self represents a blend of strength and weakness, as well as seeking for strategies. She also developed schemas for which she termed neurotic trends. Hornay believed the neurotic trends are universal and consist of strategies that help the individual cope with life. The first strategy is known as moving toward people and focuses on helplessness and compliance. For example, she explained that the individual seeks to be liked and accepted and thirsts after emotional safety. Quite often, the individual must engage in self-sacrifice to gain approval. The second strategy, moving against people, promotes isolation. It is a negative response to handling conflict as it impedes growth. Her theory can be seen as compatible to attachment theory and self-psychology, as Smith, 2007, pointed out. The third strategy is moving away from people, which speaks to the individual's need for independence, but it also tends to lead towards isolation. Hornay's theory centered around a belief that within the individual's being, there exists an inner essence which represents the source of growth, or the real self, which in turn is linked to self-realization. She believed man's quest and drive was towards self-realization, and this movement was based upon evolutionary forces. Hornay's approach to psychoanalysis was existential and phenomenological in nature. Her concept of basic anxiety could be described as unbearable to the extent that the child felt driven to act in order to relieve it and decrease the impending threat. Hornay theorized that as the child made the interpersonal move she termed moving toward, in which the child demonstrates dependency, as the child considers this to be the most emotionally safe strategy. On the other hand, the child may engage in aggressive behavior, contempt, or controlling behavior. The child may also become detached in order to avoid conflict by moving away. Hornay's argument with Freud derived from his ideas about what was known as the driving forces in neuroses that were largely instinctual in nature, and thus the driving forces were confined not just to neurotic people, but all people. This quote comes from the work of Coolidge, Siegel, Estegall, and Newsey, 2011. My own understanding of Hornay's theory continues to grow as I delve deeper into the literature, and I'm particularly impressed with her focus on culture as being the aspect that contributes to the appropriate circumstances in which, in turn, help cultivate the real self, as Hornay termed it. She theorized that we all come into the world with, as she described, the quality of being real. And our potential, coupled with the favorable circumstances, help us to develop towards a real self. This assumes we are born with vulnerability and that the favorable circumstances need to be provided by our culture. She theorized that receiving acknowledgement and validation for essentially who we are is a critical component that is instrumental in shaping our character as well as allowing our self-image to be molded further. She defined neuroses as having an aspect of fear and described it as assuming a sense of isolation and helplessness, as Rendon 2008 noted. Further, she theorized that the process of self-realization was natural, but the fear interfered with its flowering. I understand this to mean that divesting oneself of fear is an important step to take in embracing self-realization and allowing the real self to be cultivated and emerge. Hornay explained that the concept of neuroses as a psychoanalytic construct was being viewed as the focal point of what she termed psychic disorders. She theorized that these were part of character disturbances and asserted that symptoms of psychological distress emerged as a consequence of character traits that stood in conflict. She theorized that basic conflicts contributed to problems with character and affirmed that rivalry was a powerful source of conflict. For individuals enduring high psychological distress, the conflict would appear to be blown out of proportion. The behavior that ensued would be demonstrated by comparing self with others, often with those they had nothing in common with, or who potentially could have been their competitor. I understood these ideas to mean that conflict appeared to trigger a feeling of lack of self-worth in which the individual lost touch with reality and exaggerated the actual experience. Hornay referred to the content of neurotic ambition, as she termed it, as the drive to not only be a success, but to surpass the success of others. She asserted that ambitions were present in fantasies buried deep in the unconscious and sometimes having the potential to come to the surface. The ambitions of the individual never came to assume a central role in their life, but they impacted the emotional lives of the individual. They begin to exhibit towards criticism and depression. When the ambitions are not realized in their grandiosity, the individual experiences failure and views the success of others as their personal failure, as they become oppressed with a sense that they cannot measure up. Hornay analyzed feelings of inferiority deeply and asserted that these feelings constituted what she termed the most common psychic disorder of our time and culture. She pointed out, as the individual cultivates a sense of inferiority, their self-worth diminishes and hostility and anxiety increases. The more demands a culture places on the individual impacts the level of psychological distress in individual experiences in life. Hornay's exploration of the impact of culture and neuroses appears to still be relevant today. I once heard a therapist talk about what she developed, which was called an approach called rapid transformation therapy, which consisted of using hypnotherapy to help condition clients in emphasizing their self-worth. She shared case studies of successful people, including the very wealthy, who benefited from working on strengthening their sense of self-worth. Endler in 1965 noted Hornay viewed what she termed neuroses as a disturbance of the psyche driven by fears and defense mechanisms, as well as a need to attempt to, as she described it, find solutions for conflicting tendencies. Hornay, in like manner to Fromm and Sullivan, as Endler pointed out in terms of the development of behavior, did not accept biological drives were influencing behavior. Instead, she focused on the importance of interpersonal and cultural factors in the development of behavior. Hornay focused on 4 therapeutic goals in her work with her clients. For example, she asserted the therapist should work towards producing change in the attitudes of the client that would help in the realization in the expression of what she termed responsibility, inner independence, spontaneity of feeling, and wholeheartedness. In terms of the realization of responsibility, Endler 1965 noted, the individual views him or herself as a change agent and assumes self-responsibility and responsibility for others. The goal of realizing spontaneity refers to self-awareness and the expression of vitality. Interpersonal relationships nurtured by spontaneity take on the character of love and friendship. Inner independence implies the individual has the capacity to determine individual values and exhibit respect towards others. Hornay's ideas are similar to that of Carl Rogers and are also humanistic in nature. The striving after wholeheartedness refers to being authentic and genuine in one's life and work. This idea is similar to Carl Rogers' idea about genuineness as an important expression in the therapist toward the client. Endler, 1965, in his work, pointed out that the 4 goals seem to be the opposite of externalization. For example, spontaneity of feeling appears to be the polar opposite of rigidity, and wholeheartedness of being conflicted. Hornay conceptualized self-realization as another key therapeutic goal. In her view, the individual finds self-realization through the growth process. Her ideas stood in stark contrast to Freud's views, which were characterized as being pessimistic in nature. She embraced an optimistic view in that she believed the human personality had the capacity towards change. Hornay theorized that the reason for analyzing patients was not to gain insight, but instead to change the patient's attitude. This implies that a change in attitude will result in a change in behavior. Hornay focused on 2 mistaken approaches to psychotherapy that stood out to her. First, trying to understand the patient's symptoms before focusing on the structure of the patient's character, and attempting to discover a link between the patient's childhood experiences and their presenting problems. For Hornay, focusing on the structure of the patient's character was most important. However, she also gathered data about the patient's childhood experiences, as she felt this information provided insight into the patient's current problems. In addition, Hornay sought to understand the purpose of the patient's neurotic attitudes and the impact on the patient's behavior and interpersonal relationships. In her work, Hornay used interventions similar to that of Freud in order to bring unconscious material to the conscious level of awareness. For example, she made use of free association and dream analysis and interpretation. It appears Hornay believed that these approaches could help the patient tap into the unconscious so that she and the patient could explore the underlying meanings. This approach also reminds me of phenomenological psychotherapy, in which the patient's experiences and their meaning are the focus of the treatment. Quinn, 2010, noted the process of phenomenological work entails a focus in immediacy or here and now experiences between the patient and the therapist. As such, the therapist engages in the experience of being with patients as well as being for him or her. A phenomenological therapist is guided by creating a shift in the patient, but also by simply being with an individual in a manner in which they embrace total acceptance and are able to understand themselves. I believe for Hornay, facilitating the understanding of self was key in her work. Hornay's theory aligns well with my own work, as I essentially use a person-centered approach with marginalized populations at times, such as women with histories of incarceration, as well as children who have endured trauma, with parents who have been entangled with children's services as a result of child neglect. I have found in my own work with these clients, adhering to Hornay's therapeutic goals, especially that of self-realization, can be helpful with the clients that I work with in embracing change and growth as they move forward in their therapy. The population that I have worked with have been victimized by trauma and also have endured and continue to endure social problems concerning and associated with living in poverty. As such, they have often experienced a sense of hopelessness and lack of direction. Hornay's approach has been considered optimistic in nature, in that it empowers individuals to be autonomous once their inner conflicts and their impact have been explored. She believed that life experiences were also therapeutic, and that clients have the capacity to change their behavior once they understand their inner turmoil and how it has impacted them. Engaging in life and finding fulfillment in healthy experiences, Hornay considered a form of therapy. Hornay explained that individuals can thrive once their fears and anxieties have been alleviated. Applying these ideas to my own practice would help engender trust. As I work with clients in encouraging autonomy and self-realization, and this would allow them to access the wisdom within. I also believe a person-centered approach encourages the individual to become an expert in their own lives and destiny. Hornay valued gathering data about her patient's childhood to see if there was a connection with their presenting problems. This strategy is very important in working day to day with parents and children, as often the therapist can discover intergenerational maladaptive patterns that interfere with healthy parenting. I expect that I want to continue to apply this exploration to help my own clients develop insight into how to reduce maladaptive schemas with my guidance and expertise, and I hope to further develop that in the future. The sense of encouraging my patients to develop independence is also critical for me, as it promotes growth. Like Carl Rogers, Hornay viewed the individual as being in a constant state of growing and evolving. Most important of all, Hornay did not pathologize her patients, but viewed them in a holistic way. Rather than focusing on symptoms, she centered her attention on the whole person, or the structure of their character, as she termed it, probably exploring within to find the patient's strengths, which would be instrumental in their healing. Thank you for tuning into Creative Psychotherapy, and I look forward to meeting you again for the next episode. This is Audrey O'Neill, your host.
Thank you for listening to Passionate World Talk Radio. You can listen to this program all over again by going over to https://passionateworldtalkradio.com. You can also hear it on Spotify, Spreaker, Amazon Alexa, AMFM247.com every Tuesday evening between 8 and 9 p.m. YouTube, Facebook Live, LinkedIn, and all the other podcast directories one can find on the internet.